Welcome to The Story Talks Back. Almost everything that we remember, think about, or imagine is a story. Stories entertain us, inform us, and even define us. They have upsides, and they have downsides. This podcast explores the power of story in every aspect of our lives. I'm Dave Stanton. Thank you for joining us. Tim Page is a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer, editor, and critic who has forged a remarkable career from his passionate interests. As a child, he became a minor celebrity when Kodak promoted his amateur filmmaking in a commercial. His lifelong love of music led him to become a world-class critic with the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other newspapers. Page has written or edited more than 20 books, championing the work of pianist Glenn Gould, novelist Dawn Powell, and composer Virgil Thomson. More recently, he has written in his book Parallel Play about his discovery in his mid-40s that he has a form of autism. In 2008, he founded an interdisciplinary music and journalism program at the University of Southern California, where he taught for over 10 years. In 2015, he suffered a traumatic brain injury, a life-changing event from which he is still gradually recovering. We spoke while Page was living in the Manhattan apartment he has rented and occupied on and off since his days as a Columbia University student. So I wanted to thank you, Tim, for joining us on The Story Talks Back, and we really appreciate your time and effort.
It's a great honor, Dave. It's great to see you again, even from such a distance perspective.
Right. I want to start by just talking to you about, stories in your life beginning at a logical place, which I think is your childhood, when you were the subject of a well-known short documentary, A Day with Timmy Page, which really chronicled your efforts to make movies. You made a lot of movies when you were a 10-year-old boy. So I wondered if you could tell us a little about how you got interested in movies and what those movies were about.
Well, the movies were, I got interested in movies because I became fascinated by silent film. And there were very kind librarians at the University of Connecticut those days who let this weird little obsessive kid get access to what he really loved, which was going and reading about silent movies. I was also fascinated by old records at the same time, and I think between the two of them, that's really when everything kind of exploded in my brain. I became fascinated by that sort of thing. But I read everything I could about silent movies and saw them on rare occasions when I could. And you could buy for about $7.98 these little 10-minute old Chaplin films, Mabel Normand films, and things like that. And so that became my favorite gift of choice for the next few years.
Uh-huh.
And then one day when I was about 11, I was still 11, I got my father to come out and use his movie camera and take a movie of me and my friends doing this sort of strange pseudo Griffith type film. And so we did it, and he filmed 2 more movies. And then I think in part because he didn't really want to be out in the sun all the time listening to his own son, scream at people, he said, why don't you make your own? So I started filming the films myself, and teaching people how to film the scenes I was in. And it taught me a little bit about camera work. And it started me both editing inside the camera. When I got the film, I would, cut it up and change it around. but also I edited as I did it. I shot everything in the early films in chronological order so that, you know, you could watch the film and maybe I'd cut out some error here and there. But, and it just fascinated me. I have to say, in all honesty now, and the honesty that you can admit in your, you know, mid 60s, that one of the reasons I did it was because I was wretched at making friends in those days. And this allowed me to invite friends over to the house, and they would come and they'd star, and, you know, it was kind of exciting stuff back then. And there was just starting to be this interest in young filmmakers. So they would come over, and I would film them, and then I'd invite them back a week or so later to watch the film. And I ended up making quite a few of these. And what happened was, one of the cousins of one of my actors was an actual filmmaker in New York. He was 24 years old, and he did this with his wife, Iris Hoffman. His name was Dave Hoffman. And they came up and spent literally a day with Timmy Page. And they shot pictures of me showing my films and making, you know, rather tart comments about some of the actors. I mean, the critic in me was already beginning to boil. And then they spent a whole day with me out making a new movie. You know, it was very exciting, and it got presented a lot of places. It was presented at, I think, the third New York International Film Festival, and there was also a festival of young filmmakers, and I was not the youngest. There was actually a young girl who was 4. Her name was Christina Rodriguez, and she was from the Bronx, and she made what she called My Movie, and it was a charming little film. But, you know, it was strange because all of a sudden, by the time I was 12, I was signing autographs and giving interviews because they made a Kodak movie about me. And the Kodak commercial, rather. And the basic gist of the commercial was, now movie making is so easy, even a child can do it. And they gave me Super 8 cameras to work with. And I, you know, I started to develop some techniques, and you know, I worked on it for a while. And actually last year in November of 2019, I had a full evening of the films shown at the Echo Park Film Festival out in Los Angeles. And it was a lot of fun. And I chose 2 films which I thought it had at least some glimmerings of artistic merit. And I talked to the audience, and I have that material if you might want it. I can send you that. But so it was an interesting time, and it was kind of coming back to the beginning, because here we are 53 years after I made my first film, and this was the first time. I mean, some of them had been shown on television and at different things, but it was really the first time that there was any serious interest in my filmmaking, because there was a group called the Center for for Home Movies, and they presented this, and we're talking about doing it in New York and Chicago if this, you know, this current pandemic we're in, I should mention that, ever lets up and lets us start doing fun things like that again. But I was touched by it. You know, I think I had some small talent for being a filmmaker, and if I remained interested in that, I think I might have ended up actually being a filmmaker. But I didn't, you know, and by the age of, you know, 15 or so, I was, you know, just going out and getting high with my friends and pan zooming to the sun and all that kind of stuff. So I would say that after about 14 or 15, I more or less just gave it up, you know, and there we are.
I was wondering, you were talking about music and silent films, these were your passions. I mean, were the stories of people like D.W. Griffith or Charlie Chaplin or Caruso, were their personal stories really captivating to you? Is that what fascinated you?
Well, I certainly read through them all, with whatever books I could find. But you know what? You know what it really was, Dave, is I think I was a rather frightened and morbid kid. And my grandfather died in the next room from me when I was almost 3. And I don't actually remember it, but I do from my mom's diaries and from a few dreams and things like that. It made a really strong impression on me very early. And I think one of the things that fascinated me about these films was that it had somehow granted about silent films and about old records was it had somehow granted these people an immortality, which
Mm,
I didn't feel from say looking at drawn pictures or anything like that. It was
mm,
the fact that somehow I could look at these people alive again and listen to them directly alive again. And for me, it became kind of a reassurance that things can live on and you can
mm.
actually be in touch with these people. And I was fascinated and I read about them all the time and I watched them. And I think in some ways it was both an obsession and on some level a strange sort of comfort.
Mhm, mhm. Were there stories in your family? I mean, were your family members storytellers, or were there family stories that really kind of helped you understand who you are?
Well, my mom kept diaries and my dad did at certain times. And once I learned a little about the times and the places, I would ask my grandmother, who the one who lived for a long time and came and spent a month with us every year. I would also ask these wonderful women in their 80s right down the street about what they remembered, including of silent films that I even then knew were lost.
Wow.
And I became sort of a historian, just a natural historian. I grew up on a college campus at the University of Connecticut, and I should add that back then they really allowed me to do anything I wanted around the campus. I could take out books, I could listen to records in at the music library, and I basically educated myself. But I also was fascinated by the history of the town that I lived in,
Uh-huh.
and so I would talk to these people down the street without a recorder, alas. I really wish I had one, but I would just go for talks. And these, women in their 80s would be fascinated in telling me things about when, the main building at UConn burned down and what it was like. And they'd talk about the old fire trucks coming to it. UConn had a lot of buildings that burned down.
Yeah.
Um, and I had a history of UConn from about 1931, so I became fascinated by that. But I would go over to these people and I'd ask them about these films, and they'd tell me what they remembered of the films, 50 years before. And I remember I was especially fascinated by this one woman who had seen Theda Bara, one of the vamps of
Mhm.
silent films, and very few of her films existed. And so I talked with her about one of them, Cleopatra, which disappeared a long time ago. But there's a famous still, the Theda Bara in Cleopatra. And they'd tell me what the films were like. It probably wasn't that reliable criticism after 50 years. And they just went to the flickers to see it, but they would tell me about it, and they would tell me about books they read. And I lived across the street for a brief time from a guy who lived to be 110. He lived to be the oldest person in Connecticut, And I didn't really know him all that well because we lived across the street from when I first moved to Stores, but getting around in a small town in Connecticut in 1963, 64 was not easy. But I do remember him telling me about visiting New York right after they put on the lights, after they got gaslight and then electricity, and going down to New York, and just about, because he was born in 1868. So I just missed talking to somebody who was alive in the Civil War.
Wow.
But he would tell me all these great stories about New York, and it was just fascinating. I was just, I still have this. If something interests me, I get obsessed with it, and I go around and I find out all I can about it. And sometimes these obsessions still grab me in my almost late 60s.
Right, right.
I hope I'm not talking too much. I
No,
tend
no.
to talk a blue streak when, people ask me questions. I'm a little like those old people I used to go visit. I can't believe anyone is interested, so
No worries.
you ask and I tell.
No worries. So at some point you moved toward journalism. You decided you wanted to be a writer. That became
Well, it's
okay.
a little more complicated than that,
Okay.
because the thing that really, really got me obsessed, and really from an age much earlier than the film, was music.
Right.
And I remember, by the time I was 3 or 4, I had all sorts of impressions of music, and things I would play to again and again that would fill me with different moods. And I actually thought, in a funny way, I mean, I wasn't diagnosed as having some autism until I was about 45, but I now realize that listening to music was one way I learned about feelings. I learned about tenderness, and I learned about, being scared by things. The ritual dance of fire just drove me absolutely crazy. I was scared, but in that fun way, like going to a movie to see a horror film or something.
Uh-huh.
So I really got into that. And then I guess I sort of got into journalism when I was about 11 or 12 and started collecting records really seriously. And when I would get a new record, especially if it was a record of contemporary music, and I didn't really understand it, what I would do was I would go up to my room, and my dad had gotten a new typewriter, so he gave me his old electric typewriter,
Mm.
and I would just write a review of the record, and in my own strange way, and I would tell what my thoughts were about it. And I was amazingly arrogant. I'd say, oh, this is a bad piece of music, bad singer. And, but the funny thing is, I still sort of feel that way about some of these singers and these people I was listening to. But when I got into contemporary music, I found myself just wanting to listen to the music again and again, and then going up to my room and writing maybe 500 words about it from when I was maybe 11, 12. By 13 and 14, I was doing it a lot. And so by the time I quit doing films, which was when I was about 15, 16, 17. I became really interested. I had a rock band for a while.
Hmm.
And so I was composing for the band. And we were playing around a little bit, and I still think some of our stuff was extremely interesting for kids in remotest northeastern Connecticut. But, there was no one from record companies around to hear us. And so, it didn't really last
Mm-hmm.
very long. And our band broke up for the usual reasons, differing creative views and girlfriends quarrels and things, just the typical. I mean, you can see a lot of it in Spinal Tap, except that we never got to that kind of grandeur. But so I did that. I was in a band for a while, and I was in a terrible accident when I was 17 years old, which killed two friends of mine
Mm.
and sent me into just a plummeting depression. And I spent about 2 years just basically doing nothing, reading some. I always read, but the usual drugs, alcohol, that sort of thing. And then when I was 20, I learned how to do transcendental meditation, which is something I still do to this day,
I,
almost 46 years on.
wow.
And it suddenly taught me how to relax myself. And so then I got in as a special student, which meant my parents paid for it, at a music conservatory, which was really nice of them. And I spent 2 years there studying composition. And then during that time, I got very interested in fiction and writing and reading. I'd always read a lot, but at that point I was just reading, up to, a book a day, a book every couple days,
Mm.
certainly. And I decided I wanted to be a writer. So I did 2 years at the Mannes College of Music, and I got really good grades for the first time in my life, because when I was a kid, if it was something I wasn't interested in, I could not concentrate. It wasn't willfulness. I simply could not concentrate at all on the
Sure.
stuff I was not interested in. And so what happened was I transferred to Columbia to get the rest of my degree,
Mm.
and to write. And I ended up graduating from Columbia as with a quote unquote concentration in music and writing.
Uh-huh.
And then 1 week out of Columbia, I sent off something I had just written for myself on the complete works of Anton Webern to the Soho Weekly News. I'd done a little bit of rock writing before, but I wasn't really on top of that. But so I sent it to this paper called the Soho Weekly News, which was a sort of Village Voicey type thing, but
Sure.
less political and more about the arts. And they liked me and they put me on the masthead, and so I was there until that folded, and I was invited by Saturday Review to come write their recordings page, and then that folded. Um, and then John Rockwell invited me to come to the New York Times as a stringer, and I was there for 5 years, and then I went to Newsday, where I was there for 7 years, and then to the Washington Post, which was the end of my daily journalism career, pretty much. I occasionally do obituaries for them and occasionally book reviews.
Right.
Yeah, that was basically it. And then I went and I became USC invited me out to California to teach journalism and music.
Right.
And I'm just retiring from there, and I have no idea what I'm going to do for a job when I stop getting paid. But it's been an interesting career, and it all seems to make, to me at least, some logical sense. And I tried to make it, at least for my first 20 years, I tried to write about my childhood and the rather strange way it developed, for good and for ill, in a book called Parallel Play.
Right.
And I sometimes think I'll go on and try to write a second book along those lines, and maybe I will, maybe I won't.
No, that's a
And then,
great,
yeah, so
great
that's
book.
it.
Love that book. It's
Oh,
wonderful.
thank you. Oh gosh, thank you so much. I knew it was not a book for everybody, but I did think it would reach some people and mean something to them. And I'm pretty happy with it. I do it somewhat differently now, but that's the way it goes. And it's a dozen years old now. So, but
I
yeah,
want,
I basically like it. Although sometimes when I pick it up, I just go, oh God. But that's the writer's life.
yeah. I want to ask you, I mean, you mentioned, the book and your Asperger's diagnosis. Um, So you did only find out, or really the diagnosis didn't even exist when you were a child, I don't think.
Yeah, yeah, and it no longer exists now. Asperger's has been put into what they now call on the autistic spectrum, which actually I think makes a whole lot of sense.
Mm.
Because there came a time when a lot of people would found Asperger's syndrome sort of romantic, and we were these like
Mm.
weird little dream children who could do all this stuff. And the people who weren't gifted at something, which is probably the majority of them, would, people would say, "Oh, you're Asperger's, so you must be just great at this." Say, "No, no, no, I just want to do this," and
Mm.
sometimes they don't even find out what it is they have. I was diagnosed in 2000 at the same time we diagnosed my middle son, which is not in parallel play because he was a child then.
Mm.
And I did not think it was right to out him in this way. He now is fine with it. He turns 30 this month,
Wow.
and he's doing he's doing very well. He's turned out to be a remarkable young man. He didn't have the same utter obsessions that I did from a very early age, which were really what kind of saved my life. Because when I was a kid, I could, I mean, I was no older than 4 or 5 when my parents could put we had one of these wooden states maps where you could
Yeah, yeah. Hmm.
you'd put them all together, and there were only 48 when we got it. It was all just the lower
Contiguous.
the mainland US. But they could put states into my hands when I was about 4, and I'd have my eyes shut and I could tell entirely which ones they were. The only ones I had any trouble with and ever goofed up were Colorado and Wyoming and and New Hampshire and Vermont, because I wouldn't know which side was up for that thing. But I could do that. I knew the names and the dates of all the presidents. I could tell you them in order by the time I was 5 or 6. But I would go to school and they have me reading things, or they'd be teaching me mathematics, or they'd be doing something like that, and I couldn't concentrate. My brain would just go out the window. And I talk about a little in parallel play about how I'd go to these makeup classes, which they would hold to try to catch all of us up who basically flunked the whole year.
Mm.
And I'd do things like take a pin along to wake me up when I started to daydream, but it wouldn't work. I'd always get, I basically did very well in 1 or 2 subjects. And I had some teachers who thought I was really very intelligent, but I'd annoy the hell out of the other teachers because they could not believe I could do this one thing, but not this other thing. And it was very, very painful. It was painful and awkward, and I kept flunking out. And of course, back in the 60s, the idea of somebody autistic was somebody who never spoke or
Right.
spoke very rarely or
Right.
screamed a lot, which I did on occasion, or banged their head, which I also did on occasion.
Mm.
But I could also concentrate if it was something I knew about, and I could concentrate on it, intensely, and get it done. I mean, parallel play. It took a lifetime to live, but when I actually worked on it, I wrote one article for the New Yorker, and then I wrote the whole rest of the book in about 6 weeks,
Mm.
which I just obsessively got into it. And with my biography of Dawn Powell, who was another utterly surprising obsession, when I was about 36 or so. I worked on her and I collected her letters and I did her diaries and things. But when I actually wrote the book, I wrote it in about 4 months because it's just the way I work. I have to just absolutely isolate myself and throw myself into things. And I'm still another thing which we can touch on now, and I hope I'm not taking us too far off this topic because there's more to say, but 5 years ago, I had an acute subdural hematoma,
Right.
which came very, very close to ending my life. And I've come back, pretty well. The first two
Very well.
years afterwards, I took a leave of absence after a year at USC when I went back there because I was getting lost on campus and I couldn't do
Mhm.
things. But I rested a lot and I still continue to rest a lot. I try to sleep, 10 or more hours a night. And I've got about 9 or 10 really good hours in me still,
Mhm.
which is, something that I'm happy about. I'm glad I've had. It's been 5 years now, and I continue mostly to get better and better. But I have to, I have to sleep, and there comes a point in the day where I just say I can't talk. Help me here, get me into bed.
Mhm.
I mean, I can get into bed by myself if I've been home, but if I'm out for, a dinner with somebody, which I'm not out very much these days, I
Mhm.
really, at the end of the day, I have to go to sleep and I have to just sleep it off. And
Mhm.
I don't talk about anything. I sometimes go on Facebook and, write some things. I've become sort of obsessed with that. But I can't do person to person communication at that time. So
I was wondering, I mean, with the Asperger's and then traumatic brain injury, these are both sort of labels that, on the one hand, they sort of give you an explanation of what you've gone through or what you're going through. But on the other hand, it seems to me like they could become reductive. They could,
yeah.
sort of become cookie cutter and possibly explain you away too easily. Do you feel that way?
A little bit. I mean, I got annoyed back about 2012 when a guy wrote an article for the New York Times about how Asperger's was then being wildly overdiagnosed, in his
Mm-hmm.
opinion. Um, and he said, "Well, here is Tim Page, who's won a Pulitzer Prize, who's written all these books, who's done all these things, and the idea that he has Asperger's, blah blah blah." But none of the people who know me well find the diagnosis remotely peculiar. I've been very lucky, and I've been able to do this. But the more important point, which is rarely made, is I think that all the quote unquote good things I've done with my life stem from my I'll call it autism now because that's what they call it. I think that I think those things, the things for which I've been rewarded
Mm-hmm.
and which have caught the interest of people, I think they're at least as much to do with my autism as was my the awful things that I did, the loss of control, the inability to concentrate, the rages that I had when I was a child, when I was
Mm-hmm.
thwarted or I couldn't, do something correctly. I can't think of any real benefits to having a traumatic brain injury. um, but on the one hand, I say that, and some things change because I was always very stressed about everything, and before it, I was always very terrified of death. I think it has something again to do with the death of my grandfather at such an early age, and all my films were full of killing and people, dying horribly. And, I mean, they weren't all that way, but a lot of them were. And I will say this, I think I had a real near-death experience. And I was rather annoyed is going too far, but I wasn't really entirely delighted when they brought me back because it felt like all the tensions and first of all, I should say there was no tunnel, there was no light, there was nothing like that. I'm not claiming this is authoritative or not, But for me, it was just an absolute cessation. I just was not here. And when they sort of woke me up, and because I passed out on a plane, a train platform, and they got me to the hospital. And when they brought me back, I was not entirely happy to be brought back. It felt like, all of a sudden I had to deal with these things again, and I wasn't entirely awfully upset about it. Now, that doesn't mean if someone told me I was going to die today that I'd be really thrilled or even calm about it.
Right.
But when I was actually there, it made me definitely less afraid of death than I had been all my life, which I had been seriously all my life.
Interesting.
And then the other thing it did was, because I was always such an anxious person, I had, without really recognizing it, I had really gotten to a point where I was pretty much drinking every single night, not into, complete oblivion or anything like that. But, when you get into your 60s, and I was 60 when this happened, it's not as fun as it was when you were younger. It interrupts your sleep a great deal. And so I basically, I never say never, because if I feel like going out and having, 2 or 3 beers with somebody, and just having a relaxed time, I'll do it. And I'll usually regret it the next day. I'll usually feel a little more depressed. I usually won't sleep as well at night. And so I would say the 2 things it did was it made me less afraid of death, and it made me much, much, much less reliant on alcohol. And I just drink very, very little, and I'm also just basically very calm about most things now. It's not the obsessive me who had to do this, had to do that. Although I still do have occasional things which I feel I have to do, and we'll go into one of those later if you want. And if I'm not taking up too much time, I'll at least tell you privately about it.
Okay.
Because I got another one which begins on Friday. So,
I want
so
to
there
ask
we
you,
are.
it seemed as we were talking about that, I almost felt like you sort of viewed your Asperger's self or your autistic self as somehow a piece of you. Do you
Oh,
feel
sure.
like
And a benefit.
you can separate that out from another Tim?
Well, it's a benefit, I would say, for when it comes down to really concentrating and having to get something done. I mean, when I was a reporter, I did an amazing amount of work. I, went to concerts almost every night. I mean, you saw me in the New York Times more often than you saw, the head critics. I mean, John Rockwell was also a major workaholic, and he was our editor, and he was also my great pal there and supporter. So I don't want to suggest that he wasn't working as much, but I got paid by the piece at the New York Times. And then when I went to Newsday and to the Washington Post, my goal became to really beat the New York Times in anything I could. So I became sort of obsessive about that. And I worked very, very hard when I was a music critic. And I also did a lot of books. I mean, I've done, and I'm not bragging here, I'm just telling you this is the way it was, but I've either edited or written 20 books, and I started a record company for a while, which was kind of a catastrophe, but the catastrophe was not me. I think the records I made were good. It was just, the record company and, big record companies in the mid 90s were not, entirely pleasant places to work. But I ended up with lots of pleasant places to work. I loved working at the Washington Post, especially in the Graham years, because I was gone by the time Bezos took it over. And I loved working at USC. And I loved working, even for that matter, at Newsday. Hold on one second. I also loved working at Newsday because I was in New York. I could print anything I wanted. And I decided that I was going to go off and write about the things that really interested me. And, you know, and so yeah, I did that. And I also think it's one of the reasons why, you know, the thing about autistic kids and most autistic people remain kids in some ways. Um, I'm convinced it's one of the reasons I got to be such good friends with Glenn Gould, because Glenn was another guy who just stayed off by himself, and he loved to talk to people and he loved to do phone talks. And but you know, he was a guy who basically wanted to be kind of left alone, and you know, serious relations were very few. One of the problems, I would say, is I think my autism certainly had something to do with the breakups of my two marriages, which, you know, I'm, you know, unhappy about. But I got three wonderful kids out of one of them, and I'm still great friends with the other woman I was married to. So, you know, it's not so bad.
Actually, that was kind of my last question for you, was about Gould, because it's
Sure.
kind of our shared interest. Um, and it seems like, you know, even though he was this kind of frumpy, you know, very unkempt person, he also was extremely savvy, media savvy, uh,
Yeah,
and I think he was very image savvy, you know,
I
about
think
his
so
own
too.
image.
Yeah,
And it seems like, and I've had this happen with other people I've spoken to or about, um, you know, that the story of Gould almost overwhelms at times his music and all the
yeah.
things that he recorded and achieved as a musician. And it seems like he may have played into that a bit. Um, what do you think about that?
Oh, I think it's definitely true. Um, I think there was a new change in him coming uh, at the time I met him. I met him over the phone when he was 48, and I knew him till he died at 50. I think there were a lot of things that he would have utterly loved that he just missed. You
Mm,
know, I mean, I think, you know, one of the things he used to say is that he liked doing pieces in a different way. And he had this whole idea that people would be able to make recordings of
right,
things. And if you wanted to hear a slow version of Beethoven, you'd play Klemper for one movement. And if you wanted faster, maybe you'd put on Toscanini or something like that.
right.
And I think if the internet had been around, and if he had been able to actually sit down, say one morning, and control things by himself, because he was a control freak, which in a way I am, not the way Glenn was, and I'm
Mm,
also not, you know, I'm not Glenn in a lot of other ways, but you know, I mean, I think he would have said, okay, a Mozart sonata. Well, it might sound interesting slow, and it might sound interesting fast. And so I'm going to do 3 or 4 takes this morning and then put it out on my own website, because he wouldn't have
mhm,
had to deal with Columbia or CBS or now Sony anymore at that point. And he could have just done anything he wanted, decided if he wanted it out, decided if he liked it. And, you know, I think he would have loved the internet, just utterly loved it. And I
mhm,
think we would have seen a whole new side of Glenn Gould there.
mhm,
Now, as for I mean, he used to say actually that he knew what would sell the papers at the corner. So he definitely
mhm,
was very aware of his image. Uh, and I think there was a time where he almost got lost in that image
mhm,
in the 70s, when he was making what most of us consider to be some of his worst recordings. You
mhm,
know, there's a terrible Chopin sonata in B minor, which they didn't even issue on disc until after he died, because somebody thought, well, it'd be nice to have a Chopin disc by Glenn Gould. And it's horrible. He hated the piece. You can tell he hated the piece. And he admitted he hated the piece. And he also felt that way about some of the Mozart sonatas. I think he was becoming, he couldn't get smarter than he was when he was very young, because he was enormously brilliant, and it was obvious from a very early age. I mean, he was 14 years old and he won the highest award ever given at the Royal Conservatory of Music in Toronto. But so he couldn't get any smarter, but I think he grew wiser. And there's a very, very big difference in that. And I'm noticing it somewhat in myself. You know, you get to a certain age, and especially someone like Gould, who people were just starting to get very, very interested in him and not think of him as a freak who gave up the piano and just went out and did weird things and made weird recordings. People were actually beginning to take his ideas about music seriously. And because Glenn and I had talked a lot about his writing, and because I, you know, with some exceptions, took a lot of what he said very seriously, you know, I wrote to the estate immediately after he died and said, someone's got to do his work. I talked with him about it. I'd really love to do it. And it became my first, you know, serious book, The Glenn Gould Reader, which is still in print after, you know, 36 years. It's remained in print the whole time. And we're talking about doing a new one because other stuff has come.
Such a seminal book, really good.
Well, I would cut it a little now, because the idea then was that we wanted to get, we never expected, no one, I mean, the people who knew Glenn knew him and loved him, and we're all still quite close to each other. But we didn't expect the huge fascination with Gould. There's something like 50 books. There are, what, 10 films, including one that actually has an actor in it. And, you know, so the idea was, with the Glenn Gould Reader, we were going to do all the Glenn Gould stuff that was even remotely accessible. And for me, it's a little bulky. For me, I'd like to cut out about 150 pages because it's not all at the same level. But you know, I'm glad I did it when I did it, and it was, you know, and it was great knowing him. And I have an article which I'll send you by email if you haven't seen it, which is about how I think it was our shared autism, which no one would recognize as autism, that that made us friends.
I'd love to see that.
Oh, I'll send it to you. I'll send it to you when we get off.
Well, thank you so much, Tim. I really appreciate your time. And
oh, it's my pleasure.
Really wonderful stories you shared, and your insights into yourself and into writing. So,
well, thank you. I will put this up when you put it up. Okay. And I hope I didn't go on too long, because I have a tendency to do that.
It was wonderful. Really.
All right. All right. It's so great to see you, Dave.
You too.
The Story Talks Back is produced and hosted by Dave Stanton. The music you're hearing now was written and performed by Christopher Daydream. The theme music at the beginning of our show is an excerpt from Play by Merlin Twelfhoven, performed by Kronos Quartet as part of their 50 for the Future series. Please subscribe to The Story Talks Back on Podbean and check us out on Instagram. See you next time.